Marielle thought that it was just a normal house call, but minutes later she was hanging from a balcony, calling 112, while inside, 2 women were being murdered. Hi, and welcome to The Lowest Crime, the podcast that dives deeply into the most heart-wrenching and complex criminal cases from the Netherlands. I'm Eline, and today we're talking about one of the most harrowing cases of recent years in the Netherlands, the Almelo Crossbow attack of September 2021. This is a story of sudden violence, deep trauma, and a justice system struggling with the line between illness and intent. Before we begin, please be aware that today's episode contains descriptions of extreme violence, including murder, mental illness, and psychological trauma, so listener discretion is strongly advised. Without further ado, let's get into the story of the Almelo Crossbow attack. Friday, September 17th, 2021, began like any other day for Marielle, a dedicated nurse from Rijssen and a mother of young children. Her husband had left for work, her children went off to school, and after briefly helping out with the school crossing duty, she began her workday. That morning, she had an appointment to check in on Zonund Kardanakyan, a 70-year-old woman and a regular patient of hers, who lived in a quiet apartment building in Almelo. Marielle had visited Zonund many times before, and their interactions were always warm. When Marielle arrived, Zonund greeted her warmly at the door, having even made some of her favorite lumpiaatjes to share, a small act of kindness typical of her generous personality. Also present that morning was Maral Dermovzajan, Zonund's 52-year-old niece and fellow healthcare worker, who had stopped by as she often did. Marielle and Maral had known each other for years, sharing a close bond. Marielle had even helped Maral with parts of her healthcare training. The atmosphere was peaceful, 2 women chatting while Marielle prepared to administer an IV. What happened next shattered any sense of normalcy. Suddenly, horrifying screams and shouts rang out through the stairwell, sounds so inhumane and feral that Marielle froze. It didn't sound like anything she had heard before. Her instincts kicked in, this wasn't right. Then came pounding, loud, aggressive banging at the door. From her position inside, Marielle watched as Maral rushed to the door and engaged the extra lock, trying desperately to hold it shut and buy them some time. Marielle grabbed her phone from the table and walked towards the kitchen and dialed 112. The time was 9:14 a.m. as she spoke. "There's a man at the door with a knife. He's breaking in now, help!" The man outside was 28-year-old Kenzo K., a resident of the same apartment complex, now in the grip of a drug-induced psychosis after taking LSD. He was known to the mental health system and had previously been flagged as dangerous. The crisis intervention team had declined to admit him, citing his potential for violence, and now that danger was at their door. Marielle realized quickly that there was no way of keeping him out. The wooden frame of the door had already started to splinter. Marielle had to think quick on her feet. The most important thing was to get help to the apartment as soon as possible, so she quickly made her way to the balcony to continue her call. With her patient still on the couch and no visible escape route through the home, the situation was starting to look dire. Talking to the emergency services, Marielle's instinct told her don't hang up, don't break the connection no matter what. But she couldn't stay inside. She couldn't even stay on the balcony. All she could do was climb over the edge. The sounds from within the apartment were horrific, Zonund's, Maral's, and Kenzo's enraged shouting. In her panic, Marielle couldn't remember the apartment number. "You have to come to the apartment complex," she said, breathless and panicked. "You'll see me, I'm hanging." She had climbed over the railing and was now dangling off the edge of the balcony, hoping someone would arrive in time. Below her, she could see a police van pulling up. Officers rushed to park it directly beneath her in a desperate attempt to break her fall. Then she couldn't hold on any longer. Marielle landed first on the roof of the police van, then fell on the ground. She suffered multiple facial fractures and a broken arm, and lay wounded for nearly 20 minutes. As she regained awareness, she was covered by a blanket. Dazed and terrified, she looked up and saw Kenzo aiming a crossbow at her from his own balcony. A nearby nurse, who had rushed to help her, was forced to flee as Kenzo began to shoot. Marielle, overwhelmed by fear and instinct, ripped the blanket off and ran, through the bushes and chaos toward an ambulance. She survived, but her life and the lives of so many others were permanently changed in those terrifying minutes. Inside the apartment, what unfolded was a horrific scene of calculated, unrelenting violence. While Marielle was still clinging to the balcony, calling 112 in desperation, Kenzo K forced his way into the apartment. The two women were completely unarmed and unsuspecting. Zonund, being elderly and in need of help, was unable to even get off the couch before Kenzo got to her. They were trapped with nowhere to run. Kenzo, driven by his psychosis, was not there by accident. He had a plan, and that plan was to kill. Zonund Kardanakian, the 70-year-old patient whom Marielle had come to help that morning, was attacked first. Kenzo stabbed her 9 times, delivering deep, targeted wounds to her chest, arms, shoulders, and neck. It was a vicious, deliberate assault. Despite her age and frailty, Zonund fought to survive, but the severity of the wounds made survival impossible. Her final moments were filled with confusion, terror, and what must have been unimaginable pain. Maral, Zonund's niece and a dedicated caregiver herself, tried to defend her aunt and likely confronted Kenzo in hopes of de-escalating the situation. Maral had always been a protector, both in her work and for her family, but on that morning she was no match for the sheer brutality she faced. Kenzo stabbed her a staggering 17 times, targeting her head, chest, abdomen, arms, and back. A witness later testified that Maral may still have been alive after the attack, indicating how strong she was and how much she tried to survive. But the horror was far from over. Kenzo returned to his own apartment above and retrieved a loaded crossbow. From his balcony, he aimed it directly at the fallen Marielle and those who tried to help her. He fired. A fellow nurse beside Marielle had to run for cover. Witnesses watched in disbelief as Kenzo stood yelling from the balcony and prepared to shoot again. Many bystanders even filmed the incident. According to a witness, the way he aimed at Marielle indicated a clear intent to kill. That she survived was nothing short of a miracle. Kenzo didn't stop there. He aimed and fired his crossbow at 2 police officers. Officers demanded that Kenzo put his weapon down multiple times. When he did not respond, they fired a few warning signs. And then, when nothing seemed to work to end his violence, they fired directly at Kenzo's chest. Although injured, he did survive. For Marielle, the horror of that day didn't end when she hit the pavement. After waking up in the hospital, in pain and bandaged from multiple fractures, she asked her husband, "How's Zonund?" The answer came from detectives. "She didn't survive," they told her. "And Maral?" she asked. "No," they said, "she didn't either." Marielle's physical recovery was long and painful. She underwent multiple surgeries to repair the facial fractures and spent weeks with her arm in a cast. The physical wounds eventually healed, but the psychological trauma lingered. She experienced nightmares, anxiety, and deep emotional scars from the sheer horror she had witnessed. Her children were deeply affected as well, haunted by the fact that their mother had nearly died. Marielle later said that even months after the attack, she would find herself overcome by fear when entering an unfamiliar building or hearing loud noises. The simple act of going back to work required enormous strength and therapy. For a long time, she couldn't even walk past a balcony without freezing in place. "But there's one thing that gives her strength," she says. "I truly believe God saved me. If it were up to Kenzo, I wouldn't be standing here today." The first days after the murders, the police were unable to interrogate Kenzo K because he was still in intensive care, recovering from the bullet in his chest. As he lay, sedated and under heavy guard, the grief of the families began to unfold in slow motion, confused, fragmented, and filled with questions that no one seemed ready to answer. Outside the hospital, Dutch media and local residents speculated. Who was this man? What drove him to commit such brutal acts? But for Maral's children, Marianne and Aram, it wasn't speculation, it was unbearable reality. 15-year-old Aram was at school when the attack happened. He hadn't noticed anything unusual about that day. Like many others, he saw the shocking video of a man with a crossbow on the balcony circulating online. But he didn't connect the footage to his own family, until his father and cousin showed up to pick him up and deliver the news. "It was such a shock I couldn't even cry," Aram said later. "I thought, it's just a dream, I'll soon wake up." His older sister Marianne, then 25 and living in Belgium for her studies, had a similar experience. She too saw the crossbow video and said a silent prayer, but then kept going about her day. It wasn't until she saw the street name and recognized the apartment building that dread began to set in. Her calls to her mother went unanswered. Hours later, her father finally arrived, still disoriented from having taken the wrong highway exit due to shock. The truth came shortly after. Both women were dead. In the days that followed, the siblings barely slept. They scoured the internet for information, reading comment sections under videos, desperate for clarity. But authorities were tight-lipped, citing privacy laws. Eventually they learned the full, horrific truth. Their mother had been stabbed 17 times, their great-aunt 9. It was a deliberate, methodical attack. But what haunted them just as deeply was why this had been allowed to happen. How could someone like Kenzo K, a man with a known history of drug use, psychotic episodes and erratic, even violent behavior, still be living freely in a regular apartment block just one floor above their aunt? In the weeks after the killings, disturbing details about Kenzo began to surface. He had previously been walking the streets naked. He had stabbed himself in the abdomen. He had been arrested just days before the attack for theft. And he was addicted to LSD and cannabis and was reportedly in and out of contact with mental health services. The police knew he owned weapons, and yet, despite all these warning signs, he had not been removed from the building, hospitalized, or placed under any kind of observation. Marianne was incredulous. He was known to the police. They knew he had weapons. How is it possible that nobody did anything? She said. This is not just about my aunt and my mother. This is about everybody's safety. The mayor of Almelo, Arjan Gerritsen, initially promised a thorough investigation into what authorities had known and how they had handled the case. But later it emerged that the municipality had quietly narrowed the scope of the investigation. Rather than examining the specific decisions surrounding Kenzo K, or the exact failings of the mental health system, the inquiry focused broadly on the collaboration between institutions, a vague overview of processes, not accountability. For Marianne and Aram, this felt like betrayal. They should have acted way sooner, Marianne said. And especially they should not have let anybody with that kind of background live in an apartment building full of families. They requested that the municipality install a small memorial near the site of the attack, a bench, a plaque, something. A place where they could light a candle, say a prayer, remember. But even that was denied. The city cited complaints from neighbors. The message was clear. The trauma might be theirs to carry, but the space to grieve was not. Over a year later, on November 28, 2022, the long-awaited trial began in Almelo. For the first time, Marianne, Aram, and other relatives came face to face with the man who had destroyed their family. Kenzo K, now 29, sat in court dressed in civilian clothes, his face partially obscured by his hands. His demeanor was subdued, almost absent. He showed no visible emotion as the charges were read out. 2 counts of premeditated murder, attempted murder of Marielle by shooting at her with a crossbow while she was injured on the ground, and attempted murder of 2 police officers. Kenzo admitted he must have been the attacker, even recognized himself on video, but insisted he didn't remember anything. "I don't remember," he repeated over and over. When asked if hearing the victims' accounts jogged any memory, he simply shook his head. "It doesn't matter what I say. It doesn't change anything," he muttered. The Public Prosecution Service, OM, acknowledged that Kenzo had been experiencing a drug-induced psychosis at the time, but argued that that did not absolve him from any responsibility. On the contrary, he had chosen to take LSD, despite knowing he became violent under its influence. In fact, a month before the killings, he had written a message to a friend that he had planned to kill people while tripping. Other chat messages revealed a fascination for blood and violence. "Blood must flow," he had written. The OM called this premeditation. He chose this. He knew this could happen, and he wanted it to happen. They demanded 22 years in prison, followed by TBS with compulsory psychiatric treatment, potentially for life. When the prosecution concluded their recommendation, Aram, now 16, stood and faced the man who had taken his mother's life. He said, "My mother was murdered when I was 15 years old. In the prime of my life, I needed her. I still need her. I will never forgive you. I hope you get worse than what you gave them." He recalled the last words she said to him. "Don't forget to lock the door, and don't forget to take your vitamin D." Then she had simply said bye and closed the door. That was the last time he ever saw her alive. "She taught me to always be good to people," he said in court, "and now I have to live without her." Marielle, the surviving nurse, also took the stand. She spoke of her lingering injuries, both physical and psychological, of the nightmares, of her children's fears, and of the moment police told her that both women had died. "This is the worst thing that can happen," she said. "Absolutely horrific." Kenzo's lawyer, Jan Bart Kalk, argued that his client was not a cold-blooded killer, but someone in the grip of serious psychiatric illness. He's not trying to avoid consequences, he wants treatment. He's terrified of what he did. He never wants it to happen again. Kalk emphasized that TBS, mandatory psychiatric detention, can last indefinitely and is often longer than a prison sentence. He won't simply walk free, and he doesn't want to. At the end of the hearing, Kenzo was given the opportunity to speak. His statement was brief. "I'm horrified by what has happened. I want to be treated as soon as possible so I can understand what happened and make sure that never like this ever happens again." In the end, the court did not sentence him to prison. Instead, he was given TBS with compulsory psychiatric treatment. For the families of the victims, this wasn't enough. Their legal representatives, Sebas Dijkstra and Wendy van Egmond, criticized the prosecution's choice not to demand a life sentence. "This wasn't a spontaneous outburst," Dijkstra said. "It was avoidable, it was brutal, and it has left permanent damage. Our clients feel like they were not properly consulted. They feel dismissed." As the trial closed, the atmosphere in the courtroom remained heavy. 2 women were dead, a third barely survived, and many others, children, parents, neighbors, and colleagues, were left to deal with the long-term consequences. The question of justice remained complex. For those affected, it was about more than sentencing. It was about trust in the systems that should have acted sooner. The consequences of the attack went far beyond the individuals directly involved. For the families of Maral and Zonut, daily life was fundamentally changed. The grief is deep, and questions linger. Could it have been prevented? Could someone have stepped in earlier? For those left behind, the loss continues to be felt in quiet moments, family routines, and birthdays that now pass with empty seats. And that's it for today's episode. Thank you all so much for listening. If you appreciated this episode, feel free to give it a like or leave a comment. And also don't forget to follow The Lowest Crime on Instagram to find all images related to the case. Thank you all so much for listening, and I look forward to seeing you in the next one.